Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the dialogue with the Asian Pathfinders on corporate security in post-COVID world. My name is Shreyas Deshmukh, and my co-host, co-founder of Asian Pathfinders, and also moderator for today's session is Pallavi Ade. Before heading to the session, a little bit about the Asian Pathfinders. We have started this platform as an interdisciplinary to discuss and learn practical approach of social and pure sciences. I hope everyone can see my screen.
Yes.
So it's an informal sharing platform for scholars and practitioners to have concerns the fireside chats, which we organize every Saturday regularly, morning 11 to 12 IST, and the dialogues alternate Thursdays. Community guidelines: respect the views of others, but don't shy away from expressing yourself. Respect intellectual property and use parliamentary language. Next fireside chat, which we are having on coming Saturday, Mr. Michael Kugelman will be joining us to discuss about the developments in AFPAC region. However, due to the time zone issues, we will be starting this Saturday at 10 o'clock. And after that, on 19 December, we will have Dr. Manpreet Sethi to discuss the state of global nuclear order. And if you have any questions or query or collaborate with us or present on our platform, use our platform to discuss your thoughts, you can contact us, me, Pallavi, or Fireside Chats. Coming to the today's session. So everyone knows Pallavi. She is a co-founder of Asian Pathfinders. She is currently working as an independent consultant in the field of geopolitics and international security. She has experience of working with corporate think tanks and the government agencies. Her experience has been in the areas of geopolitical risk analysis, intelligence and threat assessment, risk mitigation, government and client relationship management, and policy advice. Previously, she worked with the MidCat Advisory Services and the National Security Council Secretariat. Over to you, Pallavi.
Okay, yeah. Thank you, Shreyas. Thank you for that. So basically, as Shreyas said, our session today is on corporate security in the post-COVID world. So I think one of the things when we were discussing about this session internally in our team, I think one of the things that came up is that corporate security has been the backbone of businesses trying to find a way out of this COVID situation, right? It's once in a lifetime kind of a situation we faced. And that's not going to go away. This is, fortunately, as analysts and everyone's been saying, this is just the start of the things to come. So businesses are going to need their corporate security divisions to keep the businesses running. And today we have a very diverse panel, and I think that says a lot about how we are living in this pandemic. We have people joining in from all across the world. I know speakers are joining us from UK. I'm from India. Shilpa is in Singapore and Siddhant is in Dubai. So we do see the diversity also in our speakers in terms of locations and the work that they do. So we have basically planned this session of 4 speakers. We're going to go with each speaker. They're going to speak for about 10 to 12 minutes, then pass it on to the next one. And at the end, we're going to have a Q&A session. Please put your chat questions, comments in the chat section. As Shreyas said, relevant content, parliamentary language, the real one, not the one which used in our Indian parliament, but definitely. And so I'm going to start with Shilpa. I think it's always a pleasure to have a friend or colleague come. I've known Shilpa as a coursemate from School of Oriental and African Studies a long time, but I've seen her work over the last 10 years. So I think it's great to have her speak. She has about 8 years of experience working with various international banks as protective intelligence analyst. She's worked on South Asia and the wider Asia Pacific region. She's worked with the Standard Chartered Group in Malaysia, Deutsche Bank in India, and she's also served as a consultant on cybersecurity. Like I said, she holds a master's in international studies and diplomacy from the School of Oriental and African Studies, as well as a bachelor's in mass media and journalism from the University of Mumbai. So over to you, Shilpa. And after Shilpa, we're going to have Barak, but before that, like I said, Shilpa, are you there? Yes.
Yeah,
Okay, perfect.
sure. Thanks so much for the introduction, Pallavi. Thanks everyone for joining in. We'll dive right into it. Let's begin with India. The crackdown against dissenters and critics of the government is likely to continue in 2021. We are going to see the continued arrest and targeting of Muslims and other minorities through existing laws, like the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, which has been used to arrest anyone from poets to human rights activists to cartoonists, and new laws like the anti-conversion law, which will likely roll out across all Bharatiya Janata Party, which is the ruling party, and across all their states. We will see civil unrest, which is likely to continue in the coming months. Protests related to these particular acts or laws, or arrests and detentions related to these laws, are likely to remain sporadic, small, and localized. So this is what makes the ongoing farmers' protest very different and very interesting. The agitation is a very layered one. It's not just farmers protesting on the street. It is not just opposing the liberalizing of agricultural markets and facilitating contract farming, but it's also in opposition of the diminishing role of the states, the weakening of agricultural produce market committee, which is also a board established by state governments to protect farmers' interests. It is also a protest against the rushed manner in which the farm bills were passed. And it's also a protest against the increasing role of corporates across sectors. Unlike other protests that we've seen in India recently, the government has called for engagement with the farmers and has offered to roll back some provisions. As I'd mentioned earlier, this is a large organized protest that is also against large corporations. So previous talks between farmers and the government were rejected by the farmers, who then called for increasing the intensity of the protests by blocking highways, boycotting certain corporations. These things are likely to have an impact on travel into Delhi from neighboring states, and also on logistics and their supply if main highways remain blocked. The government will likely have to repeal laws or dilute it to an extent that's acceptable to farmers, and the agitation will likely last well into the first quarter of next year. Which that sort of brings me to the elections which will be taking place in India's eastern state of West Bengal. They are due in the first half of 2021 and are likely to be very contentious. Following the national or the general elections last year in May 2019, it was very clear that the ruling party, the central ruling party BJP, had made significant inroads in the state. The BJP had won about 18 seats in the lower house out of 42 available from the state, which is significantly comparable to the current ruling party, which won about 22 seats. The BJP also won 40% of the vote share, which is a huge increase from the elections back in 2016. According to the latest census, West Bengal has a significant Muslim population, approximately 27%. The state also shares its borders with Bangladesh and has seen an influx of Bangladeshi migrants and Rohingya refugees. So the elections are likely to be very polarized. Coming to foreign policy, we will see India pursuing its relations with the US. Unlike the Trump administration, the Biden administration is more likely to question India on its human rights violations in Kashmir and the silencing of all forms of dissent. Ties between India and China are likely to remain strained, due to continuing border issues and Beijing strengthening ties with Islamabad. This may likely lead to supply chain bottlenecks, especially where the COVID vaccine is concerned, since a majority of the active pharmaceutical ingredients come from China into India. I am sure my colleague on the panel, Barak, would be able to throw more light on the issue. Moving on to Pakistan, the anti-government alliance, the Pakistan Democratic Movement or PDM, formed on the 16th of October, is unlikely to last very long. We've seen a lot of anti-government protests, and there has been a lot of concern whether the current ruling party, the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, will collapse. I don't think so. The coalition led by the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf party, or the PTI, enjoys the support of the military and will likely complete its term to 2023. The PDM is currently only united by their dislike for the government, and is very much going to pursue their own individual interests. So the alliance remains highly fragmented. Both internal and external challenges are likely to prevent parties from reclaiming their previously dominant positions. Having said that, I must acknowledge Bilawal Bhutto's rise in the Pakistan People's Party and the PDM coalition. He has been able to draw crowds in thousands during his anti-corruption protests in mid-October. And without political alternatives, his rise seems fairly inevitable. However, without the support of the military, his influence will be very limited. So a lot of the anti-government protests are likely to just remain where they are, in fairly localized but not very disruptive to the government as such. Pakistan is likely to remain politically stable at least until 2023. Pakistan's grey listing on the Financial Action Task Force will continue to be of great distress to Islamabad. This is unlikely to translate into strong action against terrorism financing and counter-terrorism activities. In the last few years, there has been a shift in Pakistan's focus on domestic terrorism. This can be attributed to the difference in approaches between both the Obama administration and the Trump administration. Under Obama, we saw an increase in counterterrorism activities within Pakistan. Under Trump, that has reduced, and we've seen reduced engagement between the US and Pakistan, and therefore lesser incentive for the Pakistani military to go after terrorists. This has given terrorist groups good time for capacity building. This brings me to Pakistan's foreign relations. We've seen a huge shift where earlier the government only raised issues when Muslims were targeted somewhere. They've become a lot more vocal on foreign issues since then. There is a clear sense of ambition with Pakistan's military urging Imran Khan to take some very strong decisions to align more strongly with China, Turkey, Malaysia. The deteriorating relationship with Saudi Arabia also points towards a shift in Pakistan's foreign relations. Coming to Bangladesh, we've seen a numerous amount of government protests take place across the country this year. Some have led to blocking of highways that lead to Dhaka, the country's capital. The protests have basically highlighted Bangladesh's dependence on the global demand and supply in the garment industry. The government's heavy-handed response has meant the unrest hasn't persisted, and seeing global trends, the manufacturing sector may well pick up early next year. The crackdown on the opposition, the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, is also likely to continue. Crackdowns have pushed various terrorist groups underground, which again gives them time for capacity building. The crackdowns have not reduced recruitment to Islamic State, which continue to target government or government actors like the military or the police, and those seen as enemies of Islam like journalists, atheists, bloggers. Bangladesh's issue with human displacement also will be a continued issue, especially that with the Rohingya Muslims. The government is unlikely to come up with workable solutions that please both its vote bank within the country as well as the international community. Bangladesh on foreign relations, it's going to continue to struggle to balance its ties between India and China. Coming to Nepal, Nepal has been largely stable, politically stable, and will continue to be politically stable. The differences between the communist coalition are unlikely to destabilize the government or lead to any early elections. All anti-government protests have been fairly small and localized. Coming to Sri Lanka, President Gotabaya Rajapakse won a parliament vote on the 22nd October, which pretty much gave him sweeping executive powers and weakened the role of the Prime Minister. Some of those changes include giving Rajpaksha the authority to appoint members to Sri Lanka's Election Commission and Human Rights Commission. This will ensure political stability in the near future and policy continuity in Sri Lanka. This will also lead to more discriminatory policies against the local Muslim and Tamil populations and counter-terrorism measures that specifically target these communities. It's likely also going to drive a lot of the terrorist activity underground. We are likely to see more Chinese-sponsored infrastructure projects, and which lead to obviously very localized and small anti-China protests. These protests are going to be mostly at project locations or in areas where you have the presence of Chinese workers, and bilateral ties with India are likely to remain strained. That's the update from me. Back to you, Pallavi.
Thank you, Shilpa. I think it was a great sum up of what's happening in the region and what's going to develop. And I think one of the reasons why we started with the whole idea of geopolitical risks and understanding what are the developments is when we look at businesses, we sometimes don't think that the outer world also affects a business a lot, maybe. But that has changed over the years. My question, you don't have to answer it now, but I'll tell you now, is you've spoken a lot about activism coming on the streets, right? In the different parts, be it in small quantities in some areas in South Asia or larger quantities in India and Pakistan. How do you see this affecting businesses going forward in the coming year and then forward? So I'll let you think about it, but I'm going to give it to Barak. So it is a great pleasure to introduce Barak Senior. So he is the founder of Strategic Intelligentia, if I've said it right, Barak, that provides geopolitical risk assessments. Previously, he was with HSBC as the Global Intelligence Manager, and he was a Middle East Director at the Royal United Services Institute, on whose behalf he has debriefed international and defense security policy makers and diplomats on matters related to the Middle East security. I have personally worked with Barak, I think ages ago, but at RUSI, but even then I do remember his knowledge about Middle East and the region really, really great. So great to have you here, Barak. And Barak has lectured at NATO as well as the Royal College for Defense Studies. He also staged the world's first and hugely successful conference in London at RUSI on Palestinian statehood. And he has published a book on the commercial risk entering the Iranian market. And Barak has provided analysis. He's published with a wide range of international broadcasters, Al Jazeera, BBC, CNN, Chinese CCTV, Fox News, Sky News, Voice of America. So over the different political spectrums also, as we would call it. And he has published in American Interest, the National Interest, Janes, and other publications also. These are the commercial ones. And so one of the reasons we asked Barak to come and speak on supply chain is because he's worked on this. And I think over the entire pandemic, we realized, and I know Shilpa did touch on it, on the supply chain risks. Because as businesses, when we are working, the supply chain aspect of it is very important, because we saw that when it happened with China, the dependency on Chinese supply chain of the world during the pandemic. So I'm not going to hold you between Barak's session. So over to you, Barak.
First of all, thank you so much for inviting me to speak here. I think that there's no forum more relevant than Asian Pathfinders. Already sort of at the onset of lockdown, you're talking about 8-9 months ago now, it seems like a lifetime ago, I became increasingly obsessed by Asia, and I just realized that everything needed to be perceived through the prism of US-China tensions. And if you're speaking about US-China tensions, you have to add to the fray India. You've got to add other Asian states. So for example, the Middle East peace between Israel and the UAE isn't simply a provincial peace or a bid to keep Iran down. It's about keeping China out. So everything needs to be looked within this prism of US-China tensions, this great strategic decoupling, and actually an Asian prism. What I'm attempting to do today is combine the geopolitical, the geo-economic to supply chains and business practices. So I'm not offering necessarily solutions, but I'm going to be identifying critical questions that will forge a path for identifying what trends lie ahead. And you can only get to those trends via the questions. Now, during globalization, became a cliche, we refer to the global village. Ironically, strategic decoupling at the time of a pandemic has led us with an even more interconnected world as threats merge. Vaccines may herald a post-COVID world that creates confusion and greater vulnerabilities. On one hand, immunizations may in the short term lead to supply chain risk management to be deemed as less essential because we're going to get back on our feet. On the other hand, the potential side effects may contribute to less corporate productivity and slow economic recovery, which will lead to supply chain and financial risks. Simultaneously, strategic decoupling between the US and China will continue, causing further disruptions as companies seek different manufacturing hubs across emerging markets. This will be underscored by the West's slower economic recovery or even economic setbacks, while China's economic recovery will be more rapid, partly due to its surveillance society. As states seek to regain lost economic ground, to what extent will they seek to regionalize or onshore strategically sensitive industries? Will the scope of strategic sensitive industries expand? We see that governments have expanded the definition to information technology, telecommunications, dual-use technologies with civil and military applications to include food security, biotech, and pharmaceuticals. How will states conduct a macroeconomic cost-benefit analysis of onshoring versus profitability and economic growth? How will companies balance between efficiency and resilience? How will Western governance evolve as the public sector and private sector become more fused in the process and have greater oversight of these strategically sensitive industries? Resilience entails that companies spend a considerable amount on inbuilt redundancies to diversify multiple sources of supply, manufacturing and distribution capacity, as well as to embed digital technologies such as artificial intelligence and robotic process automation that foster transparency across supply chains to identify vulnerabilities and bottlenecks. Will this serve as a disruption for smaller and medium-sized businesses? How will they keep up? How will they in turn position themselves between suppliers and consumer markets? While companies traditionally think of market gain share, how will they develop a metric for degrees of resilience? How will they contend with pressure from investors, stores, and companies that are one stage removed from consumers that have an increased consciousness of resilience vis-a-vis suppliers' proximity to consumer markets? During the onset of this new Cold War, will economies begin a process to become hybrid, i.e., a combination of manufacturing and service-based? We had the luxury since the 90s to choose one or the other. Working remotely is perceived as a new mode of generating increased economic activity. However, this in and of itself may pose cybersecurity and data privacy risk if companies are vulnerable to IP theft. The merging of these different risks lead to broader knock-on effects, which has shrunk the globe. It's become even more interconnected despite this strategic decoupling. Disruptions could occur on the supply side, and the economic downturn accompanied by increased poverty can lead to people stop consuming. This may cause lead firms and supply chains to cancel orders, which in turn can slow down transportation and logistics. The fusion of these risks that are disrupting the supply chains, for example, the financial risk of suppliers, especially smaller and medium-sized suppliers that are more vulnerable, can undermine larger corporations which are dependent upon them for deliveries. For small and medium-sized company, there is a simple equation: financial flow problems plus supply chain disruption equals disaster. This has a knock-on effect for larger companies that are reliant upon them. Larger companies may seek to mitigate this risk by early repayments to smaller suppliers so that they can stay in business. We can see the nexus between global interconnectivity and knock-on effects of risk. There's an increased awareness within the C-suite of companies of the depth of supply chains as they operate in a networked manner across multiple jurisdictions around the globe. 80% of global trade now flows through countries with declining political stability scores. In jurisdictions with slower economic recovery and acute economic disparities, there will be an increased risk of thefts of products or IP. To this end, there will be a need to conduct a comprehensive due diligence on not only your immediate suppliers, but as well as the third and fourth party suppliers. Governments are likely to wield financial instruments, offer tax incentives, insurance, and create regulations to ensure that supply chain risk management remains within the C-suite and that it's integrated within business strategies. Geopolitically, the Western markets are beset with Brexit, internal trade disputes, and tariffs, leading to supply chain risk. This is in stark contrast with Eastern markets that at a surface level are appearing to increasingly integrate. The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the RCEP, will gradually, over the course of 20 years, streamline overlapping arrangements between signatories, unify rules of origin, and deepen trade relations where the global economic center of gravity has already shifted towards that. Yet economic integration will be undermined if the Biden administration rejoins the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, in an attempt to curb China's economic influence over ASEAN economies that are US-aligned countries. This is likely to impact upon trade and supply chains, and this is incredibly significant as supply chains are not merely the manifestations of regional security and geopolitical dynamics. Today, they are deemed the critical strategic drivers of regional and global security dynamics, business operations, and are also the engine of economic activity. The merging of these threats is likely to turn white swans into black swans as risk becomes a constant, a norm. As a result, supply chains risk management is likely to stay in the C-suite. Thank you, that's all from me.
Thank you, Barak. Before we move to Siddhant for his talk, I have a question for you, because one of the things that we've seen over the last few years is a lot of countries and organizations wanting to move towards renewable energies, like solar and everything. I wanted your comment on a lot of these supply chain is still very fragmented. We have the Chinese manufacturing, say the European, like we know that Germany is moving a lot towards solar, but a lot of the manufacturing might happen elsewhere. So how do you see this energy supply basically getting of new energy like solar and other forms affected due to the geopolitical developments?
I don't only think it's the solar. I don't think that it's merely
Yeah, sorry. Can you hold on to your answer, because I'm going to come back to it after all the speakers, but I just thought I'll throw it in there. And
okay.
Over to the third speaker, Siddhant Dayal, who is the deployment specialist at Palantir Technology. Siddhant works at the confluence of technology, innovation, public policy, and strategic vision. He has founded a startup, steered venture capital, advised on policy formulation, and driven technology advocacy. Like I said, he works at Palantir. Before that, he was working with Reliance Industries as a product manager and at Observer Research Foundation as a research fellow and program coordinator. Siddhant is currently based in Dubai. Just a disclaimer, because Siddhant did request for it. Siddhant is speaking in his personal capacity and not on behalf of his organization Palantir in any way. And he will not be able to answer any question or speak for anything related to Palantir or their business, current, past, and future. So just please keep that in mind and stick to questions related to the technology aspect of corporate security. Over to you, Siddhant.
Thank you very much, Pallavi. I assume everyone can hear me loud and clear. So first off, thanks for having me. I've actually tracked the inception and growth of Asian Pathfinders for the last couple of months. So I'm a big fan and admirer. So congratulations to Pallavi and to Shreyas for an amazing initiative. And given the way you're going, I'm assuming it's only going to go from strength to strength. You've already called out my disclaimer, so I won't repeat that, but it is in my personal capacity that I speak today. Please do not assume I'm speaking for my organization or alluding to any particular individual's organizations. I've tried to anonymize as much of what I'm going to talk about. Today, I thought I gave it some thought when Pallavi reached out, and at one point of time, I was under the misconstrued impression that I should be speaking as a subject matter expert. But I realized that we have enough subject matter experts on this call today, and between the excellent work that Shilpa and Barak and I'm sure James later will cover, I thought I'd talk a little bit about my own journey and my experiences in the world of security. A service which, by the way, I'm thoroughly privileged and honored to have worked in. It's truly a silent service filled with consummate professionals, men and women who go out every day and play as silent guardians for us, so that we can continue our way of life. And they are truly the unsung heroes of our world today, because I don't think any of those successes that happen both in the private sector and in government are ever known outside, but the failures are incredibly public. So they're dragged over the coals for that. And anyone who works in geopolitical risk advisory or has worked for, I can see Shilpa smiling, and anyone who has worked in government like Pallavi will understand what I mean. The three parts that I'd like to cover today are primarily the evolution of the technology over the last couple of years, and where I think we currently are in today's day and age, and where do we think we're going. So that's my three part. If anyone has any questions or comments, please, as Pallavi and Shreya said, put it in the comments section. I'm happy to address them later. There's really no such thing as a bad question, but there's definitely bad answers. So, having said that, I think let's quickly go back to the 80s and the 90s. And for those of us who are old enough to remember, and I'm sure there's a few of them here, the 80s and the 90s actually saw the advent of the security industry in both the private sector and the public sector. You had the age of what is called sensors. where we moved away from sentries, we moved away from physical guards and physical asset management, and moved towards sensory control and perception. And that's when you have the first CCTVs coming out. So for us in homes, we had the first VHS and VCR systems and video cameras and handycams in the security industry. You had CCTVs, you had ID cards that were digital, that you could swipe and you could show where your access was and be allowed into areas and not be allowed into areas. And that sort of evolved very quickly into an ability to what I would call seeing the haystack. So if security is about finding the needle in the haystack, I think the 80s and the 90s was just, let's just see what the haystack looks like in the first place without actually having to physically be there. I would love to talk about what happened in Europe and the Middle East, but I'll try to keep more of this to an India-specific and South Asia-specific perspective. And then we move into the 90s, and this is post Beirut in '83. For those of us who are familiar with that, you have Imad and Hezbollah take out the Marine barracks and the French soldiers through a vehicle-borne IED. You have the LTT in Sri Lanka. You have the first World Trade Center attacks, which was, for those of us who remember, it was bombing in the basement of World Trade Center. And then you, of course, have the 1993 Bombay bomb blast. And that led to a shift in the way this sensor technology was being deployed, and it moved towards a second level of sophistication, which was analytics, which was the buzzword in the late 90s and early 2000s to some extent. And that is the age of systems, the age of analytics. I have thousands of CCTV cameras. I have thousands of disparate sensors that are telling me who's entering my facility, exiting my facility, but I can't make any sense of it. And worst, I can't really protect my people from it because I need an analyst or I need an operator or I need a security officer sitting there looking at that camera. And just imagine, for every one security officer in the private sector at that point of time, there was an average of 30 cameras. Now just put yourself in that position of sitting and staring at a screen for 12 hours a day and looking at 30 cameras. You can see that it's a very high stress environment. So then we moved to the age of systems analytics, where you had analytics for facial recognition. You have analytics for seeing if a vehicle is sitting too low on its suspension, in case it's a vehicle-borne IED, if it's got explosives in it. You have analytics for objects left behind. If you see a backpack left in a crowded area, the camera would alert you, the system would alert you. And then you had audio analytics, like if a gunshot was heard or a scream was heard, you would get an alert in your command center. And that was the beginning and the advent of where we are currently. A lot of which then played out in the tragic 7/7 attacks in London, where CCTV footage was instrumental in cracking that particular case. Fun fact, it was an ex-military officer who saw the CCTV footage for King's Cross Station and was just staring at it all day after 3 other people had already seen it, and noticed that there were 4 people who were walking suspiciously in a military formation, and that's how they cracked it. So then we come to the current age. And the current age is what, if we've had the first age, which was the age of finding the haystack, the second age of finding the needle, this is the third age, and it's probably not exaggerating to call it the age of needles. Now there is not a problem of finding needles. Now you have too many needles to deal with. You have haystacks of needles across the spectrum of your threat landscape. And we are literally and metaphorically drowning in data. For us to be able to separate the signal from the noise is now what most government and private sector operatives working in security do. And it is both human data and both technical data. On any average given day, a command center is receiving between 3 to 5 million alerts, from doors that are left ajar to cameras that have insects flying in front of them. It sounds mundane, but for a security threat posture, that is by far the number one irritant. And especially as there is no such thing as a false alarm in security, every alarm is equally important unless proven otherwise. And I'm sure people who come from the private sector who will definitely be remembering all those honeybees and bugs that woke them up in the middle of the night and made them go and check on a facility. And then in the current age, I think one of the greatest case studies of what this current age personifies is 26/11 in Bombay in 2008. For those of us who are familiar with 26/11, Pakistan state-sponsored actors, Lashkar-e-Toiba, committed what was by far the most drastic and heinous attack on Indian citizens and on Indian soil. And the Pradhan Committee report, which parts of it have been publicly available for a while, went back and called it a failure of intelligence. But what really is a failure of intelligence, you should ask. Failure of intelligence is something equally mundane. It's a failure of collaboration. It's a failure of being able to coordinate. It's a failure of being able to share with each other. It's a failure of living in different silos and not knowing what the left arm is doing. There was no intel coordination. There was no centralized system of alerting. There was no system or mechanism to classify intelligence alerts. The Indian government received anywhere between 15 and 20 alerts about what was about to happen, but no one was able to put the pieces together, which is the conundrum of security technologies, having the pieces of the puzzle, but not knowing what the full picture looks like. And knowing that there's people across the aisle who actually have the other piece of the puzzle and not knowing how to talk to them. And that to me sums up what was wrong with security technology in that era. And then you see in the 2000s, the growth of fusion centers, where you bring in all the systems, you bring in all the sensors, you put all the analytics on top of it, and then you try to make sense. You try to look at all of it in one single pane of glass and try to understand what is it going on. So I can see my CCTV system, I can see my access system, I can see my identity system. I know what's going on, and maybe I can figure out what's going on, but I still need to spend some time looking at it. And India saw a growth of projects. It's been interesting to see the growth of multi-agency center, the NatGrid in the 2000s, and it was still good, but it's still not there. The other thing we saw in the 2000s has been the explosion of the internet and the growth of sectors like OSINT, threat intelligence as a service. We now have almost 4 billion people on the internet at any given point of time in a month. That's almost half, if not more, of the countries, or the world's population of all the countries put together. Abbottabad, the raid was first covered by a Twitter user who happened to be standing on his rooftop and tweeted about seeing helicopters flying in the neighborhood. And this was a full 1 day before anyone had confirmed it was a military operation. Then you have the ability to harness all these individuals who are out there tweeting and talking about these things in distributed network. And now your eyes and ears have suddenly grown manifold. Then there's parts of the internet that security now looks at, which is the deep and dark web, which is a great buzzword that folks talk about, but very few of us actually understand. And that is the part of the internet which has been unindexed, which is not accessible by Google or Bing, and it's actually 95% of the internet for those of us who don't keep track of that. And that's where you find non-state actors, cross-national terrorists selling identification documents, selling drugs, and being able to share tactics and procedures over encrypted platforms. Bomb manuals proliferate. Some of the earliest recipes for pressure cooker bombs came off the dark web, and they were shared globally in this global day and age. And finally, you have the age of sentience. You have all this data, you have all these systems, you have all these analytics. You still need a human to figure it out. And then there's this misplaced sense of thinking that maybe we should spend more time replacing humans with technology. And that's where we go wrong in technology. I think technology isn't there to replace humans. It's actually there to augment our abilities to make sense of all this noise that happens in the vacuum, of being able to figure out what is to be actioned and what is to be ignored. And that's why we have concepts of artificial intelligence, machine learning, which are built around the ability to augment your ability to find something, to find that needle in the haystack, to suggest what it would look like. Finally, I'd just like to touch upon the fact where we think we are going tomorrow. I think tomorrow, and especially in the COVID age, what this has brought about is an increased acceleration in two things. The first is there is an increased growth of businesses moving to the cloud, and not just private sector business, but even governments. Intelligence agencies now have their private clouds on which they run their systems and their operations, and the same for the private sector. And what we're going to see is an increase in decentralized work, where you can sit at home and access all the resources that you need and manage them in an incredibly subscription-based model. It'd be like signing up for Gmail. You can sign up for a threat intelligence service or get intelligence home delivered to you. The other thing we're going to see, which I think we forget, is human-centered design. I think the person in the loop is going to become incredibly and even more important now, and technology is going to serve that perspective. And the sort of humans we're going to see are going to be incredibly cross-functional. They're going to be multi-dimensional. They're going to be very lateral. They're not going to be steeped in one particular discipline, but they're going to be lifelong learners, critical thinkers, the sort of people who actually end up working in geopolitical risk advisory, for example, who can put the pieces together. And we're going to see a lot of industry, academia, government interaction. We already see that in India with the Defense Startup Initiative. we see the basic building blocks of data and the ability to collect data and make sense of it coming from industry and government adopting it versus back in the 80s and 90s where it came from government and industry adopted it. So initiatives like that are going to be the future of our current upheaval, and folks who have the ability to operate in this complex, uncertain, volatile environment and still be able to learn and grow are the sort of people who are actually going to be able to make a difference. And I think we have quite a few of those on this call. So those are my thoughts on this. Happy to answer any questions about this in the Q&A session.
Thank you, Siddhant. So before we move on to our last speaker, James, sorry, James, we've kept you waiting for very long, but I just have a question for you, Siddhant, and we can answer it in the Q&A session. You touched on 2611, 911. A lot of these have targeted businesses, right? Businesses have been considered soft targets for non-state actors to attack. I know that, and we've seen that over the years, companies being much more able to resist such kind of attacks with their security. But in the age of technology, using technology, how can they mitigate such risk, and how can technology also be used against them? I think if you can just elaborate on that later. But I will pass it on to James, but before that, an introduction. James Morris is Security, Safety and Crisis Manager with 17 years of experience, in the security industry with operational experience across multiple industries and across several regions of the world. James is currently the head of security services, EMEA for Aon based in London. He has worked for Aon for the past 4 years, protecting Aon's own assets as well as proving security risk and crisis management support to Aon's global client base. Before really moving to UK, James was a regional security manager in Senegal, Mali, and Burkina Faso for IAM Gold Corporation. Previously, he was the EMEA regional security analyst for Newmont Mining Corporation in Ghana, where he protected assets for the company throughout the region, including $2.4 billion gold mine. For developing the mine security and crisis management plans, James started his career in security management in Iraq with Aegis Defense Services before joining the security team in the British Embassy in Afghanistan. And I'll just add one thing. James does run this amazing platform called Security Lunch and Learn. It's held every Tuesday at, I think, 6:30 p.m. India time, so 1 p.m. UK time. And you get a really great understanding from a lot of security professionals who come and share about their experience. So do check it out on LinkedIn. And over to you, James. He's going to speak about, we kept him as the last speaker also because he's going to look at the future risks of what businesses are going to face in the coming years. So over to you, James.
Thank you very much. Can you just give me a thumbs up that you can hear me okay? Perfect. Thank you very much. So thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you for the shout out for the lunch and learn sessions. Pallavi was one of our speakers a couple of months ago now, I guess. I think one of the great things for the industry that's come out, or frankly for business in general, that's come out of COVID is I feel like there's a lot more information sharing that's happening. That we've created forums where professionals can get together much easier in a way that I don't think we really maximized or considered in the past. So it's really great for me to be here. Thank you for the invite and thanks for having me. One of the best things about being the last speaker of the 4 is that I get to hear everyone else and then I get to adapt what I'm going to say based on that. But the hardest thing about being the last speaker is I now have to adapt everything I'm going to say because the 3 previous speakers have managed to cover some of the things that I was going to do much more eloquently than I was going to. So that's really interesting to hear the 3 other viewpoints. And thanks for having me. So I get to look forward and talk a little bit about the future of the security in the corporate world. It's hard to look forward right now without thinking a little bit about what's happened before and where we've come from. And interesting hearing Siddhant talking about the evolution of the industry. Obviously, 9/11 was a big driver in me starting my security career because I ended up going to work in Iraq, firstly with the military and then private security. But looking a little bit closer to home, it's amazing when we think about 2020 and have to remind ourselves sometimes that things other than COVID have happened. And I was writing an article a couple of weeks ago, and I heard about a great phenomenon. It's called the Baader-Meinhof phenomenon, which is a phenomenon. It's actually a phenomenon in psychology where people notice things much more because they've become aware of it. And the concept was named because of a psychologist who had read an article about the Baader-Meinhof group and then started hearing and seeing reference to Baader-Meinhof everywhere he was going. So he created this concept, and the idea is if you become aware of something that you weren't aware of before, then suddenly that's what you see much more frequently. So if you see a car make that you've never seen before and you see it for the first time, suddenly you're noticing that car make all the time. And from a security perspective, from a risk perspective, there's a bit of a danger that we have our own Baader-Meinhof challenge right now, where we just think pandemic on everything that we see and everything that we do looking forward. And the reality is that there's a lot that's happened in the past year, just in the past 12 months, that aren't necessarily COVID related. And, you know, if you think about some of the things that have happened, I mean, you know, there was the huge explosion in Beirut. We've had a number of deaths. We've had major climate impacts. We've had massive bushfires in Australia. We've had record temperatures in the Arctic and ice melts, and record temperatures in parts of northern Russia, and the worst hurricane season on record in the US, and major typhoons and natural disasters all over the world. So there's been a lot of things that have happened, and looking forwards, I think we're going to have to take a step back and not just think about COVID, not just think about the pandemic, to think about everything else that's going to happen as well. But from a corporate security perspective, I'm very fortunate in my role in that I work internally for Aon, so I focus on Aon business, but I also work with a number of Aon's major clients. And Aon are a risk management provider. We work with some of the largest companies in the world, and I get exposure to a lot of major organizations from around the world. And there's a couple of lessons that I think that I've taken from the past 12 months that I'd just like to point out here. And then I promise I'll start talking about the future. But a couple of the key things that I think have come out of the past year is the importance of planning and preparation. What I have seen when we look at COVID and the response corporately to COVID is the companies that typically responded better, particularly in the early stages, or companies that identified the risk at an early point and did something. And I'm talking at an early point, I'm talking about companies that started seeing rumblings coming out of Wuhan in December, early January, and started thinking about how that would impact their business. And in some respect, that was just simply a case of looking at their own response plans and looking at their travel management plans and thinking a little bit further ahead about how a pandemic, even if it was just in the Far East, could impact the business. And that, I think, gave companies an opportunity to be ahead of the game in a lot of respects. The other key lesson that's come out of this is the importance of understanding the risks all along your business line. Too often when we think about security risks, we think about our assets. We think about just our assets. We think about our physical buildings. We think about our people. We think about our information, but we don't really think beyond that. Ultimately, a business is your chain from the very beginning to the very end. And your chain, as the old adage goes, is only as strong as the weakest link. Our supply chain, and for many companies, the supply chain was the thing that was impacted hardest and earliest by COVID. And it created a huge problem for a number of organizations. If your supply chain, as Barak has already talked about in great detail, is if the supply chain is weak, if the supply chain is heavily dependent on a single point of failure and that point breaks, then that's a catastrophic impact on your business. So from a security perspective, it's understanding that we have risks from the very beginning of our process to the very end, and it's important to understand that. And particularly thinking from a climate change perspective, if climate change comes as we think it's going to, then it's going to bring the impacts of COVID, but on a much larger scale and for a much longer period of time. And we have to understand that there are impacts all along our chain that we have to be able to identify. So again, there's lots of things that we can think about. So looking further ahead, I think I could almost separate corporate security into two buckets by things that have happened in 2020. And there are companies who unfortunately had major gaps that were identified by COVID, and there were major risks and there were major failings in their security, safety, crisis management functions. Or there were companies and there were security functions that had more exposure to senior leaders in the business than they've ever had before. For the professionals and for the business leaders who fall into that first bucket, where they unfortunately had major failings across the organization, there are now opportunities. And looking forward to 2020, there could well be opportunities where you essentially have to rebuild. You have an opportunity, hopefully, to rebuild, regain faith, regain the trust of the business. And in some respects, that will involve putting up your hands up and accepting that, you know, there were things that went wrong, there were things that we could have done better, there were things that we should have done better. But this is how we're going to do that and start all over again and move forward. For companies where they've had more exposure to senior executives, ultimately the challenge, as it always is for a security professional, is how do we maintain that relationship and how do we maintain our seat at the top table that we might have earned as a result of COVID. As anyone who's worked in security risk management or any of those associated functions for a long time will know, we are front and center when something bad happens and then we're very quickly forgotten about and pushed to the back. We have to try and capitalize on this opportunity now to demonstrate the value that we can ultimately add to the business. And this is an opportunity, I think, for some people to build on. And I look at us from an Aon perspective as an example. Our security leaders across the business have had exposure to business leaders, to senior leaders, to the C-suite that we've never had before, just because of COVID, because we've been a key element, a key function in maintaining the business and also in getting the business back on and moving again, and ultimately trying to get us back to business as normal as quickly as we can. The challenge for us now is how we maintain that, how we continue that, how we maintain the relationship with the C-suite in our individual countries, and demonstrate that we can do and that we can add more to the business. Now, that's a challenge, but ultimately it's if we're in that second bucket, then it's a nice problem for us to have. We need to be able to exploit the opportunities that we've been given, and really the way we do that is by understanding what the business is trying to achieve, and how we as security leaders, how risk leaders can facilitate that, can support that, can make that happen. And going back to the point I made earlier about looking forward, the way we have to do that is by keeping our eyes on the horizon, by understanding what's coming. Because there's too often a danger from a security perspective is we get focused on the thing in front of us, right? There's that bias, there's that it's the wood for the trees, that old adage. All we see is COVID, all we see is what's right in front of us. We spend all of our time focusing on the problem of now and not understanding that there are potentially much bigger issues coming over the horizon. However, if we're able to look out over the horizon, if we're able to see what's coming, there are also opportunities. And that's the big difference, right? How we add value to the business is by putting the business into a position where they can capitalize on those opportunities early. They can mitigate those threats early. And again, that's how we become invaluable to the business. And I go back to the point I made earlier about the success from COVID. Successful companies saw those opportunities early. They saw the threats early. It isn't an accident that Zoom has become one of the most talked about one of the most talked about organizations this year. Yes, there's an element of fortune there, but they've also put themselves in a position that they are now one of the most widely utilized platforms across the world. That isn't an accident. That's something that they've been working on as well. So how do you spot those opportunities? How do you capture those opportunities? And that's something that I think we need to be thinking about. Into 2021, the recovery is going to be uneven. It's going to be challenging. It's going to be difficult. There are going to be challenges. You know, I think sometimes we fall into the danger of thinking that the calendar is going to hit January 1st and COVID's going to disappear and we're going to get on with our lives. Well, that's not going to be the case. And I think there's been a lot of focus on the rollout of the vaccines. Obviously, you would have seen a couple of days ago in the UK, we started vaccinating the first few people, but it's going to take a long time before it happens, particularly for the distribution of the vaccine around the world. And even the development and the distribution of the vaccine is going to be uneven. And there's certainly a danger that for countries where leaders have perceived to have handled the COVID poorly and that there is uneven distribution and distribution of a vaccine, that's going to build on existing social tensions, and we could see some real challenges in a number of countries, frankly, around the world where that becomes the case. So there's a lot of things that we need to be thinking about, and frankly, we don't really know what the next couple of months is going to bring from a COVID perspective. From a business perspective, though, business leaders are obviously going to want to be trying to rebuild as quickly as they can and get us moving again as quickly as we can. I think that business travel is likely to remain extremely low for the foreseeable future, frankly, because businesses in many respects are going to be trying to rebuild and regain some profits and to reduce unnecessary expenditure. And for many organizations, there's been a realization that business effectiveness and efficiency can remain relatively high for large numbers of people if the majority of your colleagues are working from home. So, there is business travel. I don't think is going to be something a lot of people are going to be rushing back to. There's also, frankly, the health and safety consideration for colleagues as to whether they themselves have a level of comfort of wanting to get back onto a plane. So I think business travel is going to be relatively low. The aviation industry will obviously be affected by that in many ways. When it comes to things like industry events and industry networking events and conferences and the like, realistically, I don't think we're going to be seeing anything other than a hybrid model for the foreseeable future. So, from a business perspective, it's how we get business back to normal whilst maintaining low levels of expenditure. So that's going to be an interesting challenge from a security perspective, because that creates a bit of a weird balance of potentially having some colleagues in offices, lots of colleagues from home, and then the occasional straggler who's flying off to different parts of the world. So again, we're going to have to be focused on everything that the business is doing and how we best support that. Collaboration, I think, has been one of the key themes for this year from a security perspective, and that has to be a key focus moving forward. The way we, again, add value to the business is by collaborating, is by building our relationships with our stakeholders, both internally and externally. And I think another key element of 2020 has been innovation, and that's going to be as important, if not more important, year on year as we move forward. Siddhant gave a great talk about the opportunities that technology allow. One of, I think, the negative things that I've seen in this past year is people trying to take a technology solution and make it fit. It's like square peg, round hole. Just because you have technology doesn't mean it's the right technology solution for you. And that's, I think, a challenge, particularly when there's going to be a huge focus on expenditure. If we waste money on technology that doesn't work for what we are trying to achieve, then that's going to be a problem moving forward. So there's an opportunity for innovation, but I think particularly innovation that allows us to reduce costs, to maximize the services that we can offer, and particularly services that allow us to be forward focused. Again, as Siddhant just said, it's separating the signal from the noise. How do we use solutions? How do we take solutions that allow us to be more focused and more efficient and effective at what we're doing, and really to allow us to spot opportunities. Typical security challenges are going to be an issue, of course, except they are changing. So we might have less impacts of theft on physical attacks and less criminality, but we've seen a lot of scams this year. We've seen a much higher level of cybercrime. That's, of course, going to continue next year, particularly focusing on things like COVID-related scams. As people roll out vaccines, it's going to be an opportunity, I think, for cyber criminals to adapt again and utilize COVID-focused scams to try and target people. The other thing I think we need to be aware of and need to be watching out are recruitment-related scams, particularly with so many people out of work and, frankly, people getting particularly desperate for work. I think there are going to be some bad people out there trying to exploit that and looking to target desperate individuals. So again, crime is high. It's just the nature of crime that we're seeing is changing slightly. Terrorism, of course, it's something we need to be aware of, but I still think we spend, and I'm talking globally here, we have a risk of, and we often, I think, overestimate the risk of terror. It's like that problem that we have of appreciating the real risk of actual events. Like it's the you're worried about a terror event and then don't put your seatbelt on when you get into your car, right? It's the difference between, the high profile, high impact versus the thing that's most likely to hurt you. So, from a European perspective, we still talk a lot about terrorism, even though the reality is we've had a really small number of cases in recent months. And actually I think there are much bigger concerns moving forward that we need to be focused on. Politically, I'm not going to try and talk too much about this one because Shilpa has done it much better than I ever could. But politically, we're about to see a real shake-up in the world order again because Joe Biden's about to be re-elected as not re-elected, about to be elected as the next president of the United States, and he has already given indications that he wants to reassert the US as a world power in a way that Donald Trump didn't. And what that actually looks like, it's going to be an interesting one because clearly in the US there are huge domestic challenges and domestic priorities that they're going to have to balance. But geopolitically, suddenly you're going to end up in a position where potentially the US is back challenging countries like China, Russia, North Korea, in a way that they may not have done so much in recent years. But also you see an interesting dynamic in places like the Middle East, where suddenly you have countries like Israel or Saudi Arabia that have benefited hugely from Trump's anti-Iran rhetoric, as an example, suddenly having their world shaken a little bit as well. So we're going to see some interesting snow globe dynamics in the next couple of years where things are getting shaken up a little bit, where countries are trying to balance domestic challenges versus international challenges. Tons of other concerns that we can talk about. Major events that have been cancelled in the last year, such as the Tokyo Olympics. You've got the Expo in World Expo in the UAE, European Football Championships. Again, how we balance generating the revenue that some countries will have been depending on for frankly a decade, versus the risk of coronavirus, and how we get those things organized all over again. Interesting regional dynamics in a number of places, particularly the Sahel region, the one region of the world where we saw the highest increase in terrorism deaths in the last year than anywhere else, places like Burkina Faso, where you suddenly have a huge terror concern, particularly the impacts that has on things like migration and forced migration, and of course climate change. This is the biggest threat. It's the biggest threat now, it's the biggest threat in the next year, it's going to be the next biggest threat in the next 25 to 30 years. Climate change is here. We are seeing the impacts now, and it's only going to get worse. Security professionals have to be thinking about the impact that climate change has on their business. And if you're not thinking about that right now, then I'm sorry to say you're missing an opportunity. So it's definitely one of the biggest things that we should be concerned about. So I think 2021, in a nutshell, is going to be an interesting year. Lots of challenges, lots of opportunities if we identify them early, but some big challenges to come as well. And I apologize, I know I went way over my time there.
That's all right, James. So before I give it to Shilpa to answer her question, I have two questions for you, and then in order of the speakers, we'll come back to everyone to answer their questions. So one is from my end. The whole idea of, we've seen at the start of the pandemic, we saw this whole WHO come out and say infodemic, right? The infodemic that we see of fake news, misinformation, disinformation, propaganda, everything mixed into it. And what Siddhant was saying, the whole idea of we being flooded with data. So how do you see, how do you think that businesses can mitigate this kind of a risk, because they are not immune to this kind of risk of infodemic? And what you said, the pandemic, we see still like only 60% of Americans are still ready to get the vaccine, and the infodemic around vaccines and other technologies, I think, it's going to possibly grow over the years. So how can businesses specifically mitigate that kind of a risk? And there's a question from Shreyas where he spoke about, you see that shift in businesses using new ways of production, innovating supply chains and other things. So how much of these methods are going to stay? Hopefully we get over the pandemic in the coming months, years, hopefully as soon as possible. And how much would we go back to the original ways? So that's from Shreyas for you. And Shilpa, my question, and there's one question I know from, again, Shreyas. So I'm just going to ask you, related to the whole economic aspect of it, right? The geo-economic aspect of stability of developing states and the future that it brings economies back on track. Will be more cohesion between states or resources crunch? So there'll be a competition that is created over resources when developing economies. So because businesses which are functioning in these economies also going to be affected by it. So if you can just elaborate on my question on choices.
Sure, sure. So yeah, coming to your question, I think pre-COVID, after natural disasters, as James mentioned, natural disasters are clearly a symptom of climate change. And we were dealing with corporations, you're dealing with flooding and typhoons, hurricanes that seem far more severe than they were before. After natural disasters, I think our biggest issues were with civil unrest, and having our travelers being stuck in various uncomfortable situations. Our employees couldn't reach office spaces in time. When you're working with a bank, you pretty much need the bank branch to be open with at least an employee. You have protests taking place right outside a bank branch. That makes it very difficult for customers to reach, for employees to reach. I think that was a major challenge that we faced. We also see, especially in South Asia, a lot of misinformation coming out when there are these protests taking place. You've seen recently in the farmers' agitation, there is so much of fake news. There are images floating around from previous protests that took place maybe a few years ago in or out of context, or from different geographies. So I think it's about constant communication. The corporate security, which was the team that I was part of, was suddenly put in spotlight. And it is about figuring out when these protests are likely to take place. Luckily, none of these are, within a second. They're pre-planned, and you hear of whispers, you hear of a potential protest breaking out somewhere, so you alert your staff, you let them know, you make business continuity plans well ahead of time, you schedule for people to be able to work from home, you send out notices prior to a protest saying that maybe a branch may be closed and therefore there'll be increased capacity elsewhere. I think things like that, that's obviously speaking a lot to the banking sector that relies on a very brick and mortar establishment. Other than that, I think also where you've seen in especially South Asia, again, there have been targeted internet shutdowns, which have impacted businesses. Suddenly you're working and then for like a few days, your internet's just been cut off. Again, this happened while we were like to a few of our offices for a stretch of, I think, 3-4 days. And fortunately, the team was on top of it. They, got business planning done. We had other teams taking up extra load that were not affected by the internet shutdown. I think these are all things that come and affect business and corporate security. This is not something that's going to go away after 2020. It's probably going to get worse in the coming years because of the kind of nationalistic attitude that a lot of countries globally are developing. It's not a symptom. I mean, it's not something you're seeing only in South Asia, obviously. That brings me to Shreyas's question on economic impact, stability, cohesion. It's a very tricky question, simply because again, there's a rise of nationalism. There is a very good reason that countries see to be self-sufficient and not depend on external resources. You see that rhetoric everywhere, from the US under Trump, under Boris Johnson. Brexit is exactly that. You have this happening in parts of Asia where you see India talking about being self-sufficient. You see that in Southeast Asia, China, everywhere. So I think it's while countries are going to talk about self-sufficiency and being independent, it's going to be very difficult because of a lot of reliance on various supply chains, on various information sharing of different kinds. And I think where they can do things on their own, they're probably likely to be very fiercely independent about it. But in things like maybe a COVID vaccine, I don't see how any country will put up their hands and say, you know, we're going to do this on our own. We are not going to depend on any other country. I think in that case, the best example again would be Pakistan, because we've seen that unlike a lot of the countries in South Asia, Pakistan depends very, very heavily on foreign aid. And you see a lot of the health care projects are almost always, or almost fully funded by international organizations. So it is almost, it's very likely that even the COVID vaccination will take place at an international organization level and not at the government level. And it's in everyone's interest that people from every country get vaccinated to the greatest extent possible. So yeah, I mean, it's difficult to say whether we'll see more cohesion or competition, but I think it's going to go hand in hand.
Barak, I'm going to ask you about my question, which is related to the supply chain of emerging technologies in the energy sector. And another question which came up, which I found very interesting, was from Prajwal, which is basically, during this entire pandemic, we've seen the inherent brittleness of efficient supply chains, the dependency on China. So do you see that we're going to start looking at stronger supply chains instead of efficient supply chains? Barak, you're on mute.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that a number of questions are echoing one another in different ways, and I would like to combine all of them if I can, including one from Tanish Saxena, right? If I've pronounced the name correctly. Okay, nice. And it also is touching upon what James said earlier, and I'm going to echo James, but I'm going to take it in a different place. First of all, Tanish was saying, is there a specific point in logistics and supply chains to focus on that can be a source of vulnerability? And I've sort of purposely adopted rather than addressing things in a topical manner, I've attempted to address things in an interdisciplinary manner, because what Tanish was asking was similar to what James said, which is you've got to see your entire supply chain, not just simply, you know, because the entire supply chain can get ruined if there's one element which has increased levels of vulnerability. And I think that by focusing on specific areas of the supply chain or logistics, it's a very reactive approach. And I think that in order to be proactive and strategic in your approach of risk, you need to be interdisciplinary in your approach. And when you're interdisciplinary, you get to a causal level of risk, because from where is risk going to emanate from, and what will it impact on your supply chain, specific areas of your supply chain, whether it be economic, whether it be political, whether it be security, whether it be climate change. That entire panoply of risk is going to be impacting on specific areas of your supply chain. And in that respect, you're adopting 1,000 square meter view, and you're just sort of having a whole holistic overview. And when you're at that point, then you end up seeing the interrelated fusion of different risks. And that's the opposite, in a sense, of the Baader-Meinhof, in that you're not seeing a specific risk, you're seeing the interrelatedness of risks. And I mean, I remember when I studied business continuity or risk management, and honestly it was so boring. I would be more stimulated if I slit my wrists, right? Because it was like reading an IKEA manual of how to put together a system, and it was outside of a context of how does political risk impact on installations, how would economic risk impact on that. And this spills over to your question, Pallavi, which is on the energy aspect of it. So again, there's the technological impact, and there's also the economic impact that will be drivers to the to how you bridge the disruption in the sort of in alternative energy supply chains. And you know, you do have increased AI and machine learning in order to derive data of your consumers in the sphere of alternative energy. So technology will be a driver of how do you manage supply and demand, right? But the question is as well, to what extent are business operations and economic activities going to be rearing back into action? Because in turn, that's going to increase that demand for alternative energy. And that, you know, when one sees the interrelated nature of political risk, and they identify, okay, this pandemic sped up a lot of pre-existing trends. It's not a trend in and of itself. Okay, so look what it did to global warming, and therefore we're going to be more cognizant of risk, but of global warming in general. So therefore we're going to want increased alternative energy systems. So I'm very, very reticent to have a specific topical approach and to focus operationally on specific areas of the supply chain. I just think you have to see a confluence of all these disciplines to see how it impacts on business practices, on the operations of supply chains. So my apology for the long-winded answer, but the reason why my answer is long-winded is because the nature of the discipline itself is long-winded due to its complexity and multifaceted nature.
Perfect, thank you, Barak. And Siddhant, my question obviously about non-state actors, but I do see something related, which is related to the recent attack on FireEye, and where there is a private entity caught between, allegedly between an attack by a state actor. The whole idea of companies getting caught up in cyber warfare. That, and another one is, I'll build up on Tanish's question where he's speaking about blockchain and cryptocurrency. Because I think we see this move, right, emerging technologies. Blockchain is one which is really the buzzword in one of the things with AI and everything. Everyone talks about it, no one understands. So how do you see this getting integrated into corporate security as a risk, I think? So that.
Yeah.
Sorry, who you asking that? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, thank you. I think I'm getting all the easy questions today. But Tanishq and Prajwal are really on fire asking all these questions. I'll quickly try to touch everyone's questions and not bore anyone. Bitcoin, emerging technology, I think that's the beauty of it. No one understands it, including the bad actors. I think folks have been following the news recently. There was a cryptocurrency bust that happened in earlier this year, where agencies in the United States seized almost $50 million worth of cryptocurrency that was being used for raising funds for, if I remember correctly, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and related actors. And the reason they were able to catch them so quickly and impound the money was the terrorists themselves didn't understand how this technology worked. So they just went ahead and decided to solicit donations on Bitcoin without realizing it's not really anonymous, and it's pretty easy to track if you've got the right technology. So I think Bitcoin, cryptocurrency, decentralized networks are definitely emerging technologies. They are the buzzword. Even from my time in venture capital, every third company we used to evaluate used to say Bitcoin, cryptocurrency, artificial intelligence, and machine learning, and almost all of them did not know what they were doing. So I honestly think this is a little overblown, especially because with respect to national security, governments around the world are very good at regulating even the unregulated market. And you don't have to look far to understand that. Hawala was a great example in the 80s and 90s. It was a big buzzword for the flow of funds for terrorism. And it turned out there used to be Hawala registers maintained by all the Havaldars, the Hawala operators. And all you had to do was just go look it up and find the people who had sent the money. So I don't think it was a problem with regulation. It was a problem of enforcement when it came to things like this. And you'll see the same thing with Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. There is a lot of enforcement that happens. People just don't know about it. But if anyone here wants to test that hypothesis, go ahead and put it on Facebook that you're raising cryptocurrency for your favorite terrorist group, and you probably have 24 hours before someone shows up at your doorstep. The other question was on non-state actors in cybersecurity, and I think the FireEye one is a very interesting one. Cybersecurity is another one of those things that people drop as a buzzword, but very few of us understand. Even I probably don't understand the depths of all these things, but the emerging threat that you see in cybersecurity is not just the pilfering of data or ransomware, for example, the ability to lock down your systems. It's actually going to be cyber-physical systems. That's where organizations are going to be. I mean, all of us in our houses, I'm pretty sure, have one or two connected devices now, including the laptop and the phone you're using. And almost all of them are speaking to the outside world, to the internet. And they're either made in China, or they're made in Taiwan or in Hong Kong. And they have IP addresses that are calling services that are based in Europe or the US. It doesn't take much for an actor, even an average well-educated programmer, to get into your home network and just extrapolate that to the national grid. I can then control everyone's home internet routers. I can connect everyone's connected baby monitors. I can connect everyone's connected fridges and thermostats. And what does that mean? It means not only can I cripple your home or your economy or your city, I can also use all those devices to cripple someone else, which is what happened a couple of years ago with what was known as the Mirai botnet, where all these connected devices got together and did a distributed denial of service attack on websites. What's happening with FireEye is different. If you look into it, you realize that, and again, speaking from a personal capacity, they've actually gone in there and pilfered their cyber weapons, which is something that happened with the NSA a few years ago, and it's happened with a couple of other companies. So what you're seeing actually is the cyber equivalent of someone going in and stealing your ammunition and arms and weaponry that you'd kept to yourself or your strategic assets. And going back to Prajwal's question, how do democracies try to keep a free and open internet against these state-sponsored actors? I mean, this is the cost of doing business. Everyone's in this game. Democracies are in this game too. Don't kid yourself. Democracies are also going out there and trying to get into other people's systems and hacking each other and trying to pilfer data and information. It's a two-way street. I think it's a little simplistic to assume that we need to protect ourselves versus them. Everyone's a rational actor in this game. The Chinese, the Russians, the North Koreans are doing it for their strategic interests, and as the Americans and the Europeans and the Indians for that matter. So I wouldn't, it's the same thing with borders in the physical world. How do you make sure you keep the bad actors out and open, and the great line about globalization, that globalization opened up the world, not just to ourselves, but to adversaries also. If you allow the free flow of capital, the free flow of goods and people, you also allow the free flow of terrorists and spies. And the short answer is yes. And that's the cost of doing business. I think that's what happens in the globalized world. So cybersecurity is just a manifestation of our physical world in other ways. And you're going to continue to see that. And I don't think anyone's going to come up with any magic solution that's going to, unless you are the great Chinese firewall, which I don't think is a solution. But I think that's where we are. Did I answer? I think, Pallavi, I didn't answer your question about 2611. I think you'd asked me earlier. Short answer is everyone learned from 2611 different ways. The government learned it in different ways. The corporate sector realized they had to invest in preemptive intelligence and harden their stance, because you couldn't always depend on you couldn't always depend on quick response teams to show up and protect you, especially when at that point of time, there's not a single armed policeman in Maharashtra who had fired a single shot in 5 years. So I think private security really changed from being a cost center into an investment, which is something James was also alluding to.
Perfect. Thank you, Siddhant. And James, over to you. And
yeah,
after
so,
that, yeah.
No, sorry to interrupt you, Pallavi.
That's okay.
So, I mean, the two questions you asked me, I'm gonna answer the second one first because it's a slightly easier question to ask. And you asked about the new ways of doing business and the new efficiencies and how much of it is gonna continue and how much of it is gonna change. The answer is a little bit of both. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Ultimately, I think we've identified some innovations and efficiencies that are good for the business. And from a cost perspective, it's going to be really hard to justify to business leaders and people who are watching costs that you need to go back to the old way. And I think probably the thing that's going to impact most people really is about travel. If you've been able to do your work and be efficient and support your businesses and your clients and develop new business and new relationships, then it's really hard to say you need to jump on a plane and go travel for 8 hours to be able to do that. I mean, I do a lot of traveling, or I did a lot of traveling. I was typically away for at least 7 to 10 days every month. And I've been able to do a lot of what I did before without getting on a plane, which, to be honest, I'm pretty happy about. So some of it will change, some of it we just can't change, because the reality is there are things that we physically have to go and do. I mean, audits, physical assessments, you know, there are things that from a compliance perspective, from a legislative perspective, you have to physically do face to face. So we're gonna see a little bit of both, and I think smart companies are gonna try and focus on finding that balance. It's identifying how we do a little bit of both and how we manage moving forward. So I think we're going to see a change. I think there are going to be some people who are chomping at the bit to get on a plane right now, and I'm personally not one of them. But good luck to you if you are that person. The first question you asked about the infodemic, the information. I mean, there's a couple of ways, I guess, to approach this. Is if you are, as a company, trying to make decisions based on information that you're gathering, I think ultimately you have to get better at identifying what are good sources and what are not. My background is intelligence, and there's a huge difference between information and intelligence, and that isn't always very well understood, particularly in a time where we have access to so much information and so much data. And as Siddhant said, right, it's the signal and the noise again. It's how do you gather all of that information in and do something of value with it. And I think ultimately it's about understanding what, who, and why, and getting that information down to something that's usable, and then ultimately getting it on to the people who need it, the stakeholders who want it, and the information and the intelligence product that you're trying to deliver. So that's a huge ask, and don't just think that because you've spent money, sometimes a lot of money, on a service that does data scraping and internet monitoring for you, there you go, you've solved your problem, because that's not the case. It's these tools are just tools, and they require a lot of work to make them valuable. And if you're talking about companies who are the victims of fake news and reputational impact, well, that's another huge threat, right? Your reputation is an asset. It's an intangible asset of the business, and any company who have suffered significant reputational damage will tell you that there's huge monetary value in your reputation, and it's becoming harder and harder to protect. So I think, again, you have to be focusing your information gathering tools on monitoring what people are saying about you, and potentially being in a position where you have a plan in place for how to respond to attacks, particularly fake news attacks, particularly fake reviews, right? I was reading a report yesterday that's saying that there's a huge increase in the last couple of months of people posting fake reviews and attack press and on their competitors. Well, this is a reality. Right, this is the world we're now living in. So we now have to be in a position where we accept that this is a threat, and you have to have a plan in place to manage that threat. And sometimes that is as simple as getting out a statement quickly through the platforms that you have access to and responding to that. The more and the worse impact of that is suddenly that it creates things like social tension that involves demonstrations against your locations. We had a case like that 12 months ago, where as a result of a plane crash in Brazil, we had local communities protesting outside our offices in Sao Paulo because they thought we were the insurer of the flight, and we weren't. It had nothing to do with us, but these were people who were angry, who'd lost family members, who'd lost, they'd lost their loved ones, and they were really, really angry, and they wanted to be angry at somebody, and somebody told them we were the people to be angry at. So we had to manage that. That was something we dealt with. It's just the nature of the world that we live in now. The information is a weapon. Your reputation is capital, and you have to be able to, you have to consider that in your planning.
I think, James, that last line, information is the weapon and your reputation is the capital, that sums up everything for this session. But I think I'm not going to even attempt to sum up this amazing session. So I think it's a great session. Thank you everyone for joining us today. And I think one of the reasons why we did, when I said at the start, the whole idea of talking about corporate security from a very different perspective, from out of our cameras and our sensors and everything, was to bring this very view that, our businesses is just not the physical space and the data that we're operating in. It's much beyond that. So thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you to Shilpa, Siddhant, Barak, and James for sticking around for well beyond the time and sharing your views. This session will be on YouTube in a few days. So check out, you can share it with your friends, family, anyone who will find it useful. So take care everyone. Have a good evening, and see you on Saturday if you guys are awake early. The times are different, but we have Michael Kugelman joining in on decoding the political communication in the AFPAC region. So take care. Good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. Bye.
Thank you, Shilpa, Siddhant, Barak, and Jay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Take care.